So today we're going to see about cellular automata, but just to recapitulate, to recap, last week we discussed about emergence, about its subjectivity, how we try to make it objective, but let's say we have limitations. And this is also related to 2 weeks ago, where we saw that everything we describe in science, and not only in science, is partially subjective. So it's not that, let's say, when we study complex systems, we face a problem that we don't face every day constantly. Just that it's more evident because, let's say, it's not so easy to ignore as in other disciplines or contexts. Um, so we already mentioned cellular automata briefly. And today we'll go into a bit more depth and also discuss discrete dynamical systems in general. So cellular automata were proposed by Sean von Neumann. So we already mentioned him. He contributed a lot to the foundations of mathematics and logic, to quantum mechanics and the Manhattan Project, to game theory, to artificial life, and precisely in that context of artificial life, he was interested in self-reproducing machines. So the question is whether a machine can produce a copy of itself. And that was an open question because there's an inherent recursion of something producing itself. And in biology, we see that, let's say, organisms make copies either by themselves or collectively. And it was a big question because it might be that there was something else beyond mechanism that would characterize life. And that's something that Elan Vital was what enabled organisms to reproduce. And the question is whether only with mechanistic terms there could be reproduction. So that was a big open question because it's basically, can we understand life scientifically or not? And if we can describe the mechanisms of life, or at least of self-replication, then it means that life, even when it doesn't become less precious or anything, let's say we can understand it in terms of its mechanisms. So to do that, he proposed cellular automata, and basically an automaton is just in computer science, theoretical computer science, there's automata theory. It's basically a formal definition of state transitions. So, and then there are rules that define the transitions from one state to another. And then this is an automaton, simply a sequence of transitions. And it's cellular because we have cells and each cell has states. So we can, I encourage you to download and play with Goli, which is this open source software for cellular automata, and it has many different examples of cellular automata. So let me see whether it has von Neumann's replicator. I mean, it has it. Let me just find it. No, self-replication. John von Neumann. So as you can see, John von Neumann was the first cellular automata to show that you could self-replicate. Actually, he couldn't build it, so it was only until, I don't know, around the turn of the century that computers were powerful enough to implement this. So let me see the whole thing. Maybe it's this one. No. This one. Okay, let's just put it to run. And so you have cells and they have different states. I forget how many states, maybe 26, 27 states for the von Neumann automaton. And each cell looks at its four closest neighbors. So the cell on top, the cell below, right, left. And depending on the states of the neighbors, it changes its state. Also, the empty cells, that let's say the empty is a state zero, let's say. And so von Neumann defined like arithmetically, oh, this cellular automata is capable of self-replication, but it was only decades after his death that we could really see, oh yeah, look at it replicate, because it requires millions of cells. And there were later other simpler replicators. I mean, we can stay here, and after a few million time steps, then we'll see the machine self-replicating. But I mean, it's just suffices to say that each state kind of codifies for something, and then there are some that serve like wires to send information. That's why there are so many states. But then in the 80s, Chris Langton, who coined the term artificial life or established the field, defined these Langton loops, and these, I forget how many states, maybe 7 or 9, say about half than von Neumann's. And then these structures basically create copies of themselves. So then there are also self-replicators. They're I mean, they're very fragile. So there were some criticisms. So then there were other variations. So Hiroki Sayama has also done some work on this. So this evolup, if I remember properly, there are some parameters that can change in time, and then let's say it's a bit more robust and let's say they basically illustrate the idea that you can build mechanisms for self-replication. So this Evo loop is a bit more realistic than the Langton loop, and there are many others. So it's a whole universe, and yeah. And then there are some, I think, Code's self-replicator is also a universal Turing machine, because von Neumann's replicator can make a copy of itself, but it cannot compute everything. And Code's self-replicator, it's at the same time a universal Turing machine, so it can compute everything. And yeah, it's a bit more sophisticated. It's also millions of cells. And so, for example, these are some logic gates, and then you can play with these to make any computational circuit. Okay, so let's go back here. So, late 60s, John Conway, who is one of the, well, was one of the most famous mathematicians of the 20th century. He was in Cambridge with his some chums, as he used to call his research group, and they were exploring rules for cellular automata, but with Go boards. So if you know Go, it's a bit like checkers. So you have boards and then stones of black or white, and then there are strategies to try to turn more stones into your color, and the one who has more stones of their color wins at the end. So they were just playing with rules, and they ended up with this. Now I have. Oh, okay. With these very simple rules, and it's a classic example of why interactions are relevant. But basically, and he called it the game of life. So you imagine that every cell is a cell, and it can be dead or alive, state 0 or 1. And if there are too many live cells around the live cell, then there's not enough food, not enough resources, and it dies. So you count how many live neighbors there are around each live cell, and then death comes to those that have too many neighbors. And by too many, I mean more than 3. And if it has too few, meaning less than 2, then it will be cold, lonely, whatever, and it also dies. So in order for a cell to survive, it requires 2 or 3 neighbors. And then around the dead cell, if it has exactly 3 neighbors, there will be a new cell born there. And that's it. That's the very simple rules. And let me see if I can better start from scratch. Yeah, so now let me get into but I don't want this color. Can have well, doesn't matter. Okay, so let's say if we have just one cell, it dies because it doesn't have neighbors. We have 2 cells. This one has 1 neighbor. This one has neighbor. So they also die because they need 2 or 3 neighbors. So if we have 3 cells, then we have an oscillatory pattern because the cell in the middle has 2 neighbors, so it survives. The ones in the extremes have only 1 neighbor, so they die. But the ones next to the center have 3 neighbors, and then there are new cells being born there, so we get an oscillatory pattern. And explore what kind of dynamics we get. This is a stable structure because each cell has 2 neighbors, so it's a static pattern called a honeycomb because it's like a hexagon. If we add another cell, it reproduces. If we add another cell, there are some stable structures, some dynamical patterns. These are other stable structures. They'll have names. I mean, there's whole zoo. These are cubes. So 2 by 2, it's also stable. All the cells have 3 neighbors. And then I can just wait a bit more. So yeah, we have stable patterns and dynamic patterns. And one might think, oh, well, what else could we find? And one of the sum chumps of Conway noticed that there was a structure that was moving on the Go boards and said, hey guys, this one is moving. So these are called gliders. And I mean, movement is not specified in the rules of the game of life, but then we say that it's an emerging property. So it's an example of weak emergence. And we can just explore the different structures. So this is called a Methuselah because it's very long-lived pattern, only 7 cells to start with. And then if we would like to predict when it will stop, we have a hard time because let's say there are some regular patterns and some active patterns, and in this region it's already stabilized, but then the activity spreads back and forth. So we can see here population and the generation. The population keeps changing because, let's say, it's not stable yet. Some gliders go all the way to infinity. But it's an example also of computational irreducibility because if we have initial condition, we have no way of knowing what will be the future if we don't go through all the intermediate steps to reach it. And so here it's more than 4,000 time steps. There's still activity. So we have to go through all the intermediate steps, and only a posteriori we can say, oh yeah, if we start with this pattern, then after 5,000 something steps, it stabilizes. So now it finally stabilizes, population doesn't change anymore, or it's not in a attractor. Sorry, it is in an attractor. But then if we just change, let's just add one more cell, and then nothing interesting happens. And like that, we can explore just changing one cell, and or similarly, we could slightly change the rules of the game of life, and then we see that in some cases, it is, let's say, nothing interesting will be observed, and in other cases, let's say, you can still preserve interesting behavior. So, just want to show. So there are still lives. Then there are eaters that eat spaceships and gliders. So those are static structures. Oscillators of different periods. So for example, here there are many of period 2, 3, 4, 6, and so on. So you can make them a bit slower. So, I mean, it's very rich dynamics. Then there are the spaceships. So all of these move in space, faster or slower, in diagonal or a straight line. And they're very fragile. So if we just add one dot, okay. If we add one dot, they get destroyed very easily in most cases. And then there are structures that generate structures. So these are called guns. So for example, there's this spaceship gun. I mean, very complex spaceship gun of very complex spaceships. So you have these whole structures, and then they start colliding gliders, and then depending on how they collide, they form this structure that is stable until it's complete, and then it starts moving. But there are I mean, they're very complex guns like these ones. And then there are very simple guns, like perhaps one of the simplest is called the Gosper's gun, because Gosper discovered, actually it was like a challenge in Scientific American in the early 70s, and Gosper from MIT found one, like because when the game of life was first described, it was like, hey, we're finding all these structures, and then there was like in a small community, like, can we find something that produces gliders? And very quickly they found it. I'm trying to find one with many guns, but yeah, I mean, and then this one, which since you can't see very well, why did they choose this color? It seems like, sorry? Could you try there? I don't know. And then I'll try to change the color. Let's change it here. And then it doesn't. Oh yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yeah, so we have these spaceships that generate gliders, and then, oh yeah, these are Gosper guns, and then they generate gliders, and we can destroy all of them, and then still some of them will survive. So the structure. Just destroy everything. It's not so easy. Life finds a way. Well, anyway. Just wanted to show you that here you can also build using these structures, logic circuits and gates and memories. So you can build a Turing machine inside the game of life. Ah, come on. Why doesn't it remember? So, I mean, it's computing something. Maybe it's just adding. And you can see that there's this constant flow of gliders, but then it's like, for example, here there's an interruption. So that's basically a bit or not. So that's how information can be processed within the game of life. Yeah, and then these gliders kind of transmit information. Of course, so this means that in the game of life you can compute any computable function, but again, assuming infinite space and infinite time. By space we mean memory, and in practice we don't have that. And also to code anything in the game of life would be horrible. And then if someone just flips one cell at the right time, everything is destroyed. And in some cases, these changes propagate throughout the whole system, and in some other cases, they don't. So that's also one of the properties of. So, for example, this is a spaceship gun. Let's see it a bit closer. You can see that there are some gliders inside. These are ethers, so they are kind of keeping the movement at bay. I'll slow down to. But anyway, I encourage you to play more with this. And just one final video. So there are these happy spaceships flying through space, and some gun is producing them. And they're colliding with streams of spaceships, and they annihilate each other. And we'll see that there's this production of spaceships and some signal circuitry around, which suggests that it's computing something, but what it's computing. So, of course, in theory, if you can compute any computable function in the game of life, you should be able to compute the game of life within the game of life. But then, let's say somebody really made it happen. So there's this arrangement in a 248 cells by 2048 by 2048 cells, where you can implement the game of life, and then they made this nice visualization that goes recursive. And of course, we can ask ourselves, what's the real level of the game of life? But that doesn't really matter. It just shows that with very simple rules, you can get extremely complex behavior and universal computation, and more structures are being discovered because just like you can have structures that generate structures that generate structures that generate structures, there's the question like, oh, how how complex could you observe behavior with these very simple rules? And let's say, um, so Stephen Wolfram, who has been explored cellular automata also for quite a while, more than 40 years, and coined this term computational irreducibility. After studying for decades cellular automata, he started the Wolfram physics project. So, I mean, I'll finish this and then I'll tell you about Stephen. So he started exploring the possibility of explaining physics in terms of simple programs, and they have some interesting results where, let's say, starting with very basic programs, more or less like the game of life, let's say a bit more sophisticated, but very simple anyway. The one can let them start interacting, and with that you get matter and time, and then you can recover general relativity and quantum mechanics, and let's say like most of physics has been in that we know expressed in terms of simple programs. Whether there's an implication for physics or not, that remains to be discovered. More recently, Stephen has been exploring this idea of the Ruliad, which is the set of all possible rules or all possible computational programs, which of course it's a very large infinite set. But then if we consider this Ruliad as such, then one can ask very interesting questions about possibilities of the computational universe. So, okay, a bit about Stephen. He was a gifted child, got his PhD very early, a bit like Norbert Wiener, I don't know, 18 or something like that. One of the members of his committee was Richard Feynman, and there's some famous letter from Feynman to Wolfram, somehow suggesting that he should learn some social skills because, let's say, extremely bright person concerning mathematics, but many people don't like him personally. And the unfortunate thing is that science is a social endeavor. And even when his ideas might be interesting, many people don't put attention just because they don't like his personality. So that's life. But anyway, the thing is that Stephen started his company that commercialized Mathematica, that some of you might have used, and has been very successful. So because of that, he became financially independent. So then he could do his own research without having to go through the traditional academic processes of satisfying tenure committees and getting grant projects and things like that. So that freedom has been, let's say, given his research very peculiar turn. I think it's valuable to have these diverse forms of doing science. The advantage is that he could focus like 10 years at once into a single project without having to give any progress report or ask for more money because, let's say, he was free from that. So that's very valuable. On the other hand, by being more or less isolated from the broader community, some people criticize him that he was not citing previous work that more or less addressed the same questions. And at the same time, his ideas have not been adopted that much outside his own circle because he doesn't interact that much with the rest of academia, and the rest of academia also has certain contempt for him because of the way he does things. And I guess there's also a bit of envy, a bit of yeah, human emotions get mixed. So perhaps one of the things that Wolfram is most famous for is elementary cellular automata. And elementary cellular automata, if we open it logo, go to computer science, cellular automata, here you have also implementations of the game of life, so you can also play in a level with the game of life. And here, cellular automata, one dimensions elementary. So they're in one dimension. So of course we can have all the cellular automata we saw were in 2 dimensions on square grids, but you can have them on triangular grids, on hexagonal grids, on Penrose tilings. I mean, there's many things, and you can have more than well, we already saw more than 2 states, but there are some stochastic versions, so with some randomness added into them. And back in the 80s and 90s, they were also a popular modeling tool because they are relatively computationally cheap. So you don't need much sophistication. So, for example, there were many traffic models, or there are still used traffic models that are based on cellular automata. Schelling's segregation model, we can say that it's kind of cellular automata. The Ising model is not cellular automata, but it's more or less on the same style. And say few very basic social models were also proposed using cellular automata. In the 90s already, agent-based modeling became more prevalent. So let's say people don't use cellular automata so much to model real systems themselves, but they are still very popular to study just to study cellular automata themselves. So there are still papers being published about elementary cellular automata even when they have been studied for more than 40 years. So let me make this a bit bigger. Just this. Okay. So in elementary cellular automata, we have one array of cells, and this can have values 0 or 1, just like in the game of life, so they're boolean. And then their transitions are determined, their next state is determined by their previous state and the state of the neighbor. So for example, show rules. So for example, this is rule 105. I will explain why it's 105. But basically, it specifies all the possible combinations of the inputs, let's say its previous state and the states of the neighbors, and the output is this one. So if all are 0, then it will be 1. If it's 0, 0, 1, then it will be 0. And you basically specify this in a lookup table. You put all 8 possible combinations of inputs, 2 to the 3, and specify one by one. So since you have 2 to the 8 possible combinations of these 8 elements in the lookup table, there are 256 possible rules. Many of these are equivalent, so we have 88 unique rules. I mean, because it's the same if instead of ones you get zeros, then you just get different colors, but it's the same patterns. Or there's some patterns that go to the right, and then if you get the same pattern going to the left, then there's reflection and things like that. So, like for example, there are some very boring rules, like 255. It means that independently of the initial state, the next state will be 1. So then it's not very boring. Sorry, not very interesting. Then if, let's say, if the state is 0, 0, 0, then it will be 0. So the number of the rule is basically if you take the lookup table and let's say the ones and zeros encode a number in base 2, you transform it to base 10, and that's 200. Let's say from 0 to 255. Those are the 256 rules. So rule 250, it's almost the same. Just creates a checker pattern. Then if we let it go, it fills the space. So not much interesting. If we start with random conditions, yeah, not so interesting. But then let's say rule 90. We get this Sierpinski pattern, which is a fractal. And in this configuration, actually, it repeats over and over again. We will start with random initial conditions. Let's say we don't get precisely that pattern, but we see that there are some regularity, some triangles of different sizes showing up now and then. But then if we go, for example, with 30, so again, there are these patterns, but if we search and search and search, we will find no regularity in these patterns. So this is a pseudo-random or chaotic rule. And actually, Mathematica uses this as for random number generation. They take a very large cellular automata and just look at the central column of this evolution, and that's random number generator. And it fulfills nicely all the properties that one wants in these numbers. And finally, famous rule 110. Oh, sorry. Here we have patterns, but they do repeat. And not only that, so again, they're called gliders because they move in space and time. But then when they collide, they can create new gliders like this one, or they can annihilate each other. And behind we see a regular pattern called ether because it's like inert towards gliders. The gliders don't interact with the ether, they just interact with themselves. And it has been studied exhaustively, like all possible collisions of different gliders and what's the outcome of these collisions. So again, with this, one can create logic gates and process information. And Matthew Cook proved in 2005 that you can build a cyclic tag system. And there's a previous proof showing that if you have a cyclic tag system, then you have universal computation. So in rule 110, you can also construct universal computers, meaning that you can compute any computable function. And I mean, the mathematics for this is like pre-K because you don't even need to add. You just kind of find a pattern and replace it, and that's it. Of course, it will be very boring to do it on your own. That's why we need computers. And also we see that this pattern, I mean, there's still gliders interacting. So there's this glider and then there are these two gliders, smaller ones. I forget whether it's stabilized already with this or not. Maybe it's already stabilized, but it takes quite a while to do so. Retransform. Yeah, maybe they cross each other and they don't alter each other anymore. Okay. So, any questions so far? Okay. So, I'll briefly mention random Boolean networks. In the other class, we saw this in a bit more detail because we will keep on using them for other topics. But here, I just want to mention that they can be seen as a generalization of cellular automata, in the sense that in cellular automata, every cell has the same rule or lookup table and the same neighborhood. And in random Boolean networks, each cell that originally models a gene has its own function or lookup table and has its own neighborhood. So you generate this randomly at the start of a run, and then you just keep them fixed and explore what are the dynamical properties of the system. Mr. Kaufman proposed this in the late 60s to study genetic regulatory networks. Back then, it was not known how many genes there were in humans or in any other species, how they were interacting. It was known that they were interacting in the sense that some genes produce proteins, and then these proteins promote or inhibit the production of other proteins by other genes. So you can assume that there is this genetic regulatory network, but we had no idea of nothing. So to use a so-called ensemble approach, basically studying these randomly generated networks and its possible space, and then to see where in that huge space of possible networks something like life could emerge. So in models, we have n Boolean nodes with k inputs on average. So for example, here we have lots of nodes, and the topology is generated randomly. So for example, this node has these inputs, which happen to be the neighbors, but then this one has its inputs, this one and this one. Q has P and N as neighbors. So you can see that, for example, there are some nodes without outputs and other nodes that have many outputs. But in this example, all nodes have just two inputs. But I mean, you can also vary so that different nodes have different number of inputs. And then the functions are determined by lookup tables. So again, all possible combinations of the inputs, and then you randomly generate the output with a bias, which here let's say there's no bias, so you have the same probability of having zeros or ones. And then here, time is flowing to the right, so you have random initial condition, and after some time you fall into an attractor, which is basically a regular pattern. Since the number of states is finite, sooner or later you reach an attractor, but then the number of states is 2 to the n. So let's say already for not so big networks, you will never be able to explore exhaustively its state space. So it might be that we will never have time in practice to reach an attractor. And let's say, but in theory, yes, states will be repeated because it's finite number of states. All the states leading to an attractor are called transients. And it's a dissipative system because we have many states flowing into few states, but then from every state, there's only one successor. We can have many predecessors, like this one has many states going into it, or no predecessors. So these are called Garden of Eden states because you can only reach them from initial conditions. And then we end up with two networks, topological network, which defines the function, and then the state network, which is the function itself. The first one has n nodes of 1 bit, and the second one has 2 to the n nodes of n bits. So, of course, the state network is huge. There are different ways of finding this relationship, but let's say there's no general way of saying, oh, if you make this change in the topological network, it will have this effect in the state network. Usually we need just to do it and then try to try and see. And then we have three different dynamical regimes: order, critical, and chaotic. There are different parameters and properties that cause these different parameters. So order regime usually very quickly converges to attractors, and it's very robust. The chaotic regime, usually you never converge to an attractor. You are always in a transient, and it's very fragile, sensitive to initial conditions. So if you change one state, then what you would see later would be very different from, let's say, the original state, which doesn't happen in ordered dynamics. You can change some states and you return to the same attractor usually. And in the critical regime, it's intermediate between these two. So you make few changes, and in most cases, they don't produce big changes, but then there are some few changes that can lead to large changes. And also the attractors tend to be a bit more interesting in the critical regime than in the order regime. So Kaufman already in 1969 argued that real genetic regulatory networks should be critical because if you have order dynamics, then you are very robust, but then you can't have evolution because you make a small change and it will be a change in the genotype, does not affect the phenotype, you can't have evolution. On the other extreme, if you have chaotic dynamics, if you make a change, any change in the genotype makes changes in the phenotype, then even if if evolution found a good solution, it will be lost very quickly. So that's also not good. And then the question is, okay, how can we achieve this criticality? We as engineers, because in many cases we want our artificial systems also to have this type of behavior and not this or not that. And also, how could evolution have reached the criticality that we observe in real cells that was observed only like 20 years ago, so much after Kaufman made this conjecture. So one way of doing this is with this bias P, with the number of connections. So usually the more connections we add, and this applies for all systems, the more interactions there will be. And then this usually quickly leads to chaotic dynamics. We have less interactions, we usually have order dynamics. And P is basically whether if we have many ones or many zeros in the lookup table, that basically makes irrelevant many of the inputs. And another property is canalization. So for example, here in theory, we have two inputs, but in practice, just X defines the output. So the more canalization we have, also the more ordered dynamics we will have. And then we can play with the topology. So normal topologies, meaning that we have more or less the same number of inputs per node. We have more and longer attractors. We have skewed topologies, mainly imagine just one node controlling all the other nodes. Then we have less and shorter attractors, and with scale-free topologies, basically few with a lot, many with a few. We get critical-like behavior where we would normally find order. And then with modularity, which is prevalent in nature, and we also discussed in Herbert Simon's papers how it's, let's say, its advantages, how it's prevalent. And in random Boolean networks, we explore how this basically expands criticality into the chaotic region, because you would expect by the number of connections that you would have some chaotic dynamics, but then basically you have more intramodular links than extramodular links. So perturbations just propagate within modules, but not all over the network. So that gives you criticality. And also possibility to adapt at the modular level without changes propagating to other modules. And then with Tu and with Ilya Shmulevich, we studied what happens when you have different types of redundancy. So it turns out that it makes networks more robust, and degeneracy also makes it more robust, but in a different way. So they're complementary. And let's say if we have perturbations, so every now and then, so this is an example of how the dynamics would look. So here we have an ordered network, and if we add few perturbations, then it looks a bit more complex. We have already some complex behavior, k equals 3, and if we add perturbations, then it looks chaotic. So, I mean, we studied antifragility in random Boolean networks. Antifragility, I mean, it's a whole topic, but I'll just say that it's property of systems to benefit from noise. So basically, if you are ordered and you add some perturbations, then you will go closer to criticality, and that's good. If you're already in criticality and you add more noise, then you go into chaos. And it turns out that real cells are antifragile. So they are in the order regime, but close to criticality. And depending on how much perturbations they have, then that takes them to criticality. Yes, so these different cell types. So for example, immune cells, mammalian, cardiac, they're more antifragile. Tumor cell, it's less antifragile. Or Arabidopsis, it's a plant cell, and they have huge redundancy. Plants have lots of redundancy in their genomes, meaning that they have lots of copies of the same genes. And by lots, I mean ridiculous amount. Many plants have more genes than humans. And then we also show that if you have multi-layer structure, then that also facilitates antifragility. So there's some results. You have multiple layers. And more recently, we studied the effects of different types of heterogeneity on random Boolean networks. So let's say already random Boolean networks are a heterogeneous version of cellular automata, because cellular automata, you have the same function and topology for each cell, and random Boolean networks makes it heterogeneous. But then still they have the same, more or less the same number of inputs and same temporality and the same function. So what we did was to vary this. There were already some previous studies about heterogeneity. I mentioned briefly about scale-free topology, which is prevalent in many real networks, and that basically expands a bit the criticality region of random Boolean networks. We also have temporal heterogeneity. So, for example, solar flares, they don't occur regularly. And one of the criticisms towards the classical random Boolean networks model is that they have synchronous updating, meaning that all the nodes are updated at the same time, just like in Cellular automata. And the criticism was that real cells don't have that synchronicity. Genes don't march in step. And there's this model of asynchronous random Boolean networks proposed by Iman Harvey and Terry Bossomeyer. And the thing is that they pick one node at random and then they update that. And then they pick another node at random and they update that. But what they did was not only to add asynchronicity, but also randomness, because not only you're updating one node at a time, but every time will be a different order. And that destroys your attractors, because it matters if you update first one node or another node, you go into different states. So then you have loose attractors that are different types of attractors. Point attractors are the same, but let's say you have different properties, and then they were arguing that therefore random Boolean networks were not good models of genetic hereditary networks. And I learned about this from Inman with my master's in Sussex. So he was teaching the course of artificial life. So my final project was exploring what happens when you have asynchronous updating, but with deterministic asynchronous but deterministic updating. And it turns out that you end up with properties much more similar to classic random Boolean networks. So basically the big difference was because of the randomness, not because of the asynchronicity. But anyway, back then I was proposing this deterministic asynchronous updating, and with that one can construct random Boolean networks with temporal heterogeneity, namely that some nodes can update slower than others. And we, let's say, from previous work on rank dynamics, we were basically deciding that nodes should update as slow as their connectivity. So more central nodes with more connectivity, update their state slower, and those with low connectivity, they update faster. And again, this increases criticality. And finally, functional heterogeneity. We introduce heterogeneity in the biases of the lookup tables. So instead of all nodes having the same bias, which is usually 0.5, on average it's 0.5, but then with a distribution, some nodes will have, let's say, 0.4, some nodes will have 0.7 bias. So then again, that increases criticality. Yeah, so this is a quick picture of the results. This first curve to the left is the homogeneous random Boolean networks, classic model. And this curve is of complexity, so it goes maximum near the phase transition, and then it goes down as it goes into chaos as you increase the number of connections. If you add structural heterogeneity, then let's say you reach higher complexity, say for higher connectivity, but the area where you have high complexity broadens. And as you add more, let's say this is functional and structural heterogeneity, and this is structural, functional, and temporal heterogeneities. The area under the curve of complexity becomes broader and broader. So we say that you expand the parameter space where one observes critical-like behavior. Or in other words, you get criticality for free when you add different types of heterogeneity. And also antifragility sometimes. So if you have homogeneous temporality, functionality, and structure, you can have for more perturbations and for more connections, more antifragility, but the maximum antifragility it's found for very precise values of the homogeneous case. So basically, if you know precisely what you want, usually homogeneity will give you a good solution. If you don't know precisely what will be the solution or the problem is changing constantly, usually heterogeneity has greater variety, and therefore you can explore a very broad region and get good solutions, perhaps not the best, but for a very broad range of parameters. So if your system is changing within that range of parameters, you don't need to do anything. The heterogeneity of the system will take care of that variety. Yeah, so this is how we measure complexity, which is not so relevant here. So this will be for next week, Thursday. More readings about complexity. And questions for now? So in Brightspace, probably you saw already there's a post for selecting potential projects. If you haven't put your name there, please put your name because soon you'll be presenting your ideas. And the readings for Thursday, they're also there already. So uploaded by the end of tomorrow so that on Thursday we can discuss the papers. Okay, so see you on Thursday.